Hello and welcome back to the KCC channel. I'm Rob and I hope you're having a wonderful day today. Today we're going to jump into some ProRevenge. Our first story today comes to us from Chapter 8 FF. Escalating feud leads to dad orchestrating his brother's arrest. Let's jump right in. My uncle has always been a self-righteous petty slimeball with a foul temper and grandiose idea of his own importance, but little to no brains. My dad always just took it and tried to keep the peace because family is so important to him. This is the story of how my uncle finally pushed my dad too far and ended up getting arrested for his trouble. It is pretty long since it covers several months of a feud between them. As background, my dad and my uncle are neighbors in a rural community of 600-ish people. My dad built the house my uncle lives in and sold it along with a small plot, so my dad's remaining land is about 6 acres and runs along the side and back of my uncle's smaller property. My uncle is a dealer for HVAC units. My dad is in the HVAC business and would buy some things from his brother even though his brother's prices were higher and he had more limited inventory than other dealers in order to help his brother out. My dad also rented a building his brother owned and used it as his shop and office. He only rented the building and parking lot, but in the field out behind the shop, my uncle and my dad would both collect old HVAC units. These things are rusty and all around fugly, but when they didn't have anything else to do, they could go get one of these old units to break down for scrap. This story starts when one day my dad went to his brother and said he needed a certain unit, but his brother quoted him a really high price and also couldn't deliver in the time frame my dad needed. So my dad called up another dealer he works with, and that guy had a unit on hand to give him for a much lower price. A no-brainer. My uncle found out about this somehow. Dudes in the HVAC business are apparently like gossipy teenage girls, and confronted my dad, basically giving him an ultimatum that if my dad wouldn't commit to buying 100% of his units from my uncle, then my uncle wouldn't sell him anything. I already told you my uncle is an idiot. So my dad didn't say anything to his brother, but he took him at his word and stopped buying anything from him. A month or so later, my uncle showed up at my dad's shop and confronted him again, wanting to know why my dad hadn't ordered anything from him that month. When my dad told him why, my uncle exploded. They apparently had a screaming match, and in the end, my uncle announced that my dad was no longer his brother. They were no longer doing business together, and my dad was evicted from the shop. I will note that legally my dad was not evicted because evicting him would have required a legal notice, a certain period of time, etc. But my dad was over it, so he said fine and began converting the barn at his house into his new shop. So my uncle, who apparently had thought my dad would not call his bluff, showed back up at the shop a few days later and informed my dad that he also had to move all of the old HVAC units scattered around in the field behind the property, or he would sue my dad for the cost of removal. Now, this too probably had no legal power, since my dad's lease was only on the building, not the field, and my uncle contributed to and used the old units as communal property. But when my dad is pissed off, he is really pissed off, so he agreed to move the old units. He took his tractor over and loaded each one onto his flatbed trailer, drove out behind his barn, and painstakingly arranged hundreds of rust bucket fugly old HVAC units an inch or two off the property line at the back of my uncle's house. Note that my dad could not see these things from his house due to the way his property is set up, but my uncle had an HD view of them in his backyard. My uncle started being even more of a creep than usual and was always spying on my dad's house. So my dad decided to build a privacy fence down the side of his property that runs along my uncle's property, but not the back of the property where the HVAC units are. The fence guys arrived and worked for a few hours before my uncle came screeching into his driveway and exploded out of his truck, already screaming because these poor fence guys had laid posts or tools or whatever temporarily on his side of the property line as they were building the fence. My uncle called the police, who basically told the fence guys, "Okay dudes, just don't put anything on this crazy man's property," and they left. The next day, apparently someone left a hammer across the property line, so here comes my uncle screaming at them again. He called the police again, but by the time they got there, the guy had already moved his hammer, so the police were just annoyed by this point, but could only warn them not to do it again. Later that afternoon, my uncle called the police a third time. I kid you not. This time, he wanted to report that my dad had stolen a backhoe from him, like one that attaches to the back of a tractor, One that, again, I kid you not, my uncle had given to my dad 2 whole years prior because my uncle didn't even have a tractor big enough to attach the thing to. The cop was not amused when this story came to light, and since it was the same cop who had been there earlier that day, she was beyond annoyed at that point. My dad helpfully said, "Come get the backhoe if you want," knowing full well my uncle had no way to pick the thing up or haul it even the few feet to his own yard. My uncle replied that my dad was just trying to trap him and would say he was trespassing if my uncle came onto his land, even though the cop was standing right there when my dad offered, and, by the way, this conversation was taking place in my dad's driveway. He then said that he wanted to file a complaint with the police that basically amounts to a restraining order against my dad. It isn't a restraining order because it isn't issued by a judge, but the cops treat it that way. It's for habitual trespassers. Annoyed cop helpfully informed my dad that this would mean that even if my uncle texted or emailed him and invited him to come over to his house to discuss things, even if my dad had that written proof he'd been invited, if my uncle called the cops or even took a picture of my dad on his property, he could potentially get arrested for trespassing. My dad said he wanted to file one against his brother too. The ProRevenge part of the story is now upon us. My dad knew full well that his brother had no real clue where the property lines were and was not going to dig up his survey to check. He only knew where the lines were because my dad knows exactly where they are and maintains wooden stobs in the ground periodically along his property lines. So when his brother was away for a few days, my dad moved all of the old HVAC units along the property line over further onto his own property by a few feet and moved the stobs back the same distance. So basically, it looked the same as it had before, except it looked like the property line was a few feet further back than it actually is. He then placed some random piece of scrap across the fake property line, still on his own property, but it looked like it was across the property line if all you had to go by were the incorrectly placed stobs, set up a few game cameras aimed at the line, and waited. Sure enough, his dumbass brother came storming out of his house as soon as he noticed this scrap on his side of the property line, crossed the real property line to get a good look at the scrap, and called the police. My dad was waiting for them with his survey, showing where the actual property line is, a copy of the report annoyed cop had given him, and game camera footage of his brother clearly trespassing on his land. And it was my uncle who got arrested. The only way his revenge for all the trouble and heartache his brother caused could possibly have been any sweeter would have been if it were an annoyed cop who showed up at the scene and arrested my uncle. But alas, he had to make do with someone he and his brother had both gone to high school with, which worked out since it was especially embarrassing for my uncle to be arrested by someone he knew well, and who could make sure everyone else in town knew. OP added an edit at the bottom to kind of sum things up. It says, "Nothing really came of my uncle's arrest, or at least not that my dad has heard about, and he'd heard about it since this is a town of like 600-ish people, but it was probably enough for my uncle just to have to get put into handcuffs, spend a night in jail, and have people know about it because my uncle hasn't caused any more trouble for my dad other than generally existing where my dad occasionally has to see his truck drive by. My uncle is also now in a business dispute with his wife's sister and his brother-in-law, so presumably he is trying to take his anger out on another target who hasn't already beaten him, and also who isn't his older and much larger brother who has been perfectly willing to beat his butt all their lives whenever it's devolved into physical dispute. Yes, my family are rednecks. My uncle, aunt, cousin, and my cousin's wife all unfriended me on social media, so I only know what's going on with them via small town gossip nowadays. My sister was driving down the road recently, saw my uncle in his yard, and waved at him. He turned away like he didn't know her. None of us got an announcement when my cousin's wife had her baby recently. So I think the end of the story is just that we are all dead to my uncle and his family, but he is too afraid to do anything besides pretend we all don't exist. Ah yes, don't we just love watching the self-involved idiot trip over their own ego? A perfect ending to this story. Do me a quick favor, have a look down below the video. If that subscribe button's still red, it means you're not actually subscribed to the KCC channel. Please hit that subscribe button for more daily Reddit stories. Our second story today comes to us from Texan Native 71. Do shady thing, fire my boss, hide millions from your client? I don't think so. Let's jump right in. Forgive me if this is long, this happened a while ago, but it's still so fresh in my mind. I left college with a business degree in one hand and no job in the other. And like so many colleagues, the promises of alumni willing to give jobs to graduates could not have been further from the truth. So I had to seek out my start from the bottom. I found a good job in operations at a company, I can't say who without giving it away, had a great boss who taught me pretty much everything I needed to know, work was great, and the money was good. I need to explain how the business worked so you can understand how the plan worked. This corporate office was in California, and we were not. There are a lot of things that went on at this company, and I can't get into all of them because it would just take away from the story, but let's just say they had a very Stratton Oakmont vibe when it came to sales. I started out working in operations with some of the smaller clients, but with some help from my boss was able to climb the ladder rather quickly to the point of being over all the operations and order processing for the firm. We had a very large client, 90% of the company's business. The way it worked was we had two sets of sales reps, TSRs and CSRs. TSRs were the heavy hitters who reached out to the other big businesses and tech firms to extend their warranties on a product. They made real good money. The CSRs were more of the mom and pop crowd and the inbound sales calls for those that wanted to extend their warranties. The reps were all given codes that associates the client's files with theirs, so if someone did a renewal automatically, they would get paid as it was their client. Pretty sweet gig. The client hired the firm to be the middleman for their B2B as they handled all of their everyday clients. For every $100 that came into our firm, 18% or $18 would be for the company, and the rest would be sent to the clients with their warranties activated. Most of the clients paid by credit card or purchase order with a wire transfer, but there would also be a good amount of checks each week that would need to be processed. A little while after I started, the client check portion was now going to be overseen by one of the sales managers. Didn't really faze me because I was working on the smaller accounts. Since we were a publicly traded company, all the sales reps' orders had to go to operations to be fulfilled. They weren't allowed to process them on their own. This is when things started going downhill. My boss at the time was given temporary access to the financials as they were hiring a new CFO, and he had a background with it. We went to lunch like we had done plenty of times before, but he seemed different. When I asked him if something was wrong, he told me that something looked off with our biggest client for one of the accounts. He wanted to make sure before he said anything to the higher-ups. While this was going on, I had been offered the chance to be our new compliance officer, which means I would need to make sure everything was on the up and up. Soon after, I come in to find out that my boss was just terminated for a multitude of reasons, all of which had to be untrue, because he was a pretty well-liked guy, with not just the company but with our client as well. As I log into my terminal, I see that before he left, he had given me admin access to his files. Here's where things started to pop off. Remember those checks that clients were sending in to renew their warranties? Well, we were cashing them all right. Apparently, we just weren't adding these renewals to their products in the system. That would have triggered a payout to our client, who, as you remember, would be getting 82% of that money. Instead, they were cashing the checks, keeping the money, and using the interest in the accounts. Yes, in the mid-2000s, banks actually paid interest to cover their losses in the collections department. It was wild to see that this was happening, and something had to be done, so I hatched a plan. First things first, secure a new job, cause it won't be a fun place to work after this. Done. My previous boss knew of other companies that would scoop me up, put in my notice, and stated in my exit interview that I just couldn't be a part of what was happening, even though HR was in on this. I wanted it on the record. Next, get approval for overtime for all the operations crew to come in on a Saturday and double pay them. They arrive early Saturday, obviously not too thrilled as to why they're there, but when I explain that if they complete the task, not only do they get their overtime, but they get nice bonuses, they were much happier. They spent the entire day applying all of those checks, dated back years to the client's accounts. We are talking millions of dollars. When all the sales reps arrived Monday, they were shocked as hell. Not only did they meet their weekly goals before picking up the phones, they made their monthly and quarterly goals too, 2 weeks into the new quarter. Cheers, partying, yelling, screaming, celebrating, except sales management. They went from being really excited to skeptical to confused to oh crap in about 2 hours. They realized where it must have come from. Because not only did the company hit all these sales, since it had been over a day, the client came into work Monday to see a very nice payday in their system as well. and like anyone, would have questions and says they are coming out to congratulate the team on such great numbers. So management starts scrambling because they can't figure out how this happened, and all under my boss's old login. On my last day, I arrive in the lobby. I've got my box for the last of my things, etc. Guy walks up and is waiting for the elevator with me, and we strike up a conversation. He notices my box and jokes about getting fired, and I just tell him I had a great opportunity come up, so I decided to leave before crap hits the fan. We laughed. Really nice, down-to-earth guy. He realizes we are getting off on the same floor. He asks if I work for X. I say yes. He asks where. I tell him operations, and he reveals that he is the CEO of our client. We go our separate ways. Client shows up and there is a big party. Afterwards, the client says that they would love to get a breakdown of where most of the sales came from so they can allocate more money to that department. Management says sure, but it made up a lie about how they can't share client payment info due to regulations, blah blah blah. Cue my exit from the company. 2 weeks go by and I get a phone call from a number I don't recognize, so I let it go to voicemail. When I get off work, I checked it to find out it was the CEO of the client where I used to work. He has had something come up and would like to talk to me. Of course, I'm nervous as hell, but I call him back and he picks up on the first ring and we get to chatting for a bit, and he finally just asks me, "Why did you leave?" I tell him I had a great opportunity come up. He doesn't buy it and says that apparently my comment about crap hitting the fan really stuck with him and he thinks something more is going on. So after a little more prodding from him, I tell him, just look at collections and that's all I can say. He thanks me and I hang up. 2 days later, he pulled the plug on the account. Apparently, my old company tried to threaten him with a lawsuit for pulling the account 3 years early. He replied with, "That's fine, because when I show the courts that I have the evidence that you committed fraud," corporate came in and cleaned house. All of management was fired within the day. 1 month later, my friends and I had a very memorable trip in Vegas, all courtesy of our old client. So somebody in the comments completely summed up this story because it might have been a little hard to follow. It says, client outsources sales of warranties to OP's crappy firm. OP's crappy firm sells 1,000 warranties for $100 each. OP's crappy firm is supposed to keep $18 from each sale, total $18,000, and give client $82 each, total $82,000. Client would then use the $82,000 to pay out claims for manufacturing defects, and the rest is profit. OP's crappy firm instead pockets the entire $100,000, doesn't tell client about sales. If someone with a warranty makes a claim, OP's crappy firm activates the warranty and pays client the $82 on that one, but keeps the funds from the other 999 warranties that don't make claims. OP's crappy firm profit $99,918. Client has to pay out the warranty claim and is losing money because they didn't receive the funds for the other 999 warranty purchases. OP's good supervisor finds this and reports to superiors only to be crap canned. Supervisor leaves OP the keys to the kingdom. OP makes it obvious to client what's going on, but by simply doing his job rather than telling client directly, because whistleblowers are treated like crap. That's basically it, and then the client gave them a trip to Vegas because, well, that client is just awesome. Check out both OPs at the links in the description down below. Thanks for watching, have a wonderful day, and we'll see you tomorrow.